The room was quiet in the way only important rooms ever are. Not peaceful, not calm, just stripped of sound as if even the walls had learned not to interrupt. The lawyer's office overlooked the river, but the blinds were half closed, letting in a pale, indifferent light that flattened everything it touched. Adrian sat straight-backed in his chair, hands folded, expression unreadable. He looked the same way he did during negotiations that decided borders, alliances, lives, composed, sealed. Already somewhere else. Valentina sat across from him. She hadn't cried, not once. Her face was calm in a way that came from exhaustion, not strength, the kind of calm that settles after you've already survived the worst part alone. She wore a loose coat despite the warm afternoon, her hands resting lightly in her lap. No one in the room noticed the subtle way she guarded her body, no one except her. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading through the final terms. Words like settlement and separation floated through the air, formal and empty. Adrian listened just enough to know nothing here would threaten his control. The marriage was ending quietly. No scandal, no conflict. That was how he preferred it. Clean exits, minimal damage. He did not look at her while the papers were slid across the table. When the pen reached his hand, he signed without hesitation. His name flowed easily the way it always did. Signatures were promises he no longer believed in. They were just marks, signals that something was finished. Valentina watched him as he signed. There was no anger in her eyes, no accusation, just a deep, steady resolve that had taken months to build. She had already mourned this moment, already accepted it. What sat inside her chest now was not heartbreak, but certainty. When it was her turn, she picked up the pen slowly. For a brief second, her fingers trembled, not because of doubt, but because of what she carried and what she was choosing to protect. She signed her name carefully, as if each letter mattered more than the marriage ever had. The lawyer smiled politely and began gathering the documents. He spoke about next steps, about timelines, about formalities. Adrian nodded once, already calculating his schedule, already thinking about the meeting he had after this. Power did not wait, survival did not pause for sentiment. Then Valentina spoke. Her voice was quiet, not sharp, not broken, just firm enough to cut through the room like a blade slipping between ribs. "We don't need you." The words landed softly, but they landed. Adrian finally looked at her. For a moment he thought he had misheard. The sentence didn't come with drama or bitterness. It wasn't thrown like an insult. It was stated like a fact, something already decided. "You don't need me," he repeated, more to himself than to her. She met his gaze then. Her eyes were steady, darker than he remembered. There was something there he couldn't place, not defiance, not relief, something older, something guarded. "No," she said calmly, "we don't." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, sensing something private had entered the room. Adrian didn't notice. His mind latched onto the words and stripped them down to their simplest meaning. She was cutting him out, refusing his protection, his resources, his name. In his world, need was currency, dependence was leverage. To say she didn't need him was to declare independence from everything he represented. "Fine," he said after a moment, his voice even, "if that's what you want." "It is," she replied without hesitation. There was no pause after that, no final plea, no turning back. She stood, smoothing her coat, her movements deliberate. For a fraction of a second, Adrian thought she might say something else. Explain, soften the blow. She didn't. She walked past him toward the door. As she reached for the handle, she hesitated just long enough to breathe in, then out. Not a sigh, a grounding breath, the kind taken by someone who has already decided to survive whatever comes next. Adrian remained sighted. He told himself this was what closure looked like, quiet, efficient, controlled. He told himself she was proud, stubborn, determined to prove she could do without him. He told himself she would be fine. People always were once they left his world. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Only then did the silence feel different. not empty. Watching. Somewhere beyond that door, Valentina placed a hand over her stomach as she stepped into the sunlight. She did not look back. She had already said everything that mattered. Inside the office, Adrian stood, straightened his jacket, and prepared to return to his empire. He believed the sentence meant what it sounded like. He did not yet understand that when she said we, she was not speaking only for herself. And he did not yet know what she already did. Adrian returned to his world the same way he always did, without hesitation, without reflection, without leaving pieces behind where they could be found. The car waited, the driver silent. The city moved around him like a living thing that knew his name and stepped aside for it. He leaned back in the seat, eyes forward, mind already shifting from what was done to what still needed to be controlled. Power did not pause for endings, and neither did he. The syndicate headquarters rose from the street like a sealed promise, concrete, glass, steel, and silence inside. Men moved with purpose, conversations stopped when he passed, doors opened without questions, respect followed him like a shadow. This was the space where emotion had no value, where hesitation was weakness, and memory was dangerous. Adrian had built this world with precision, with discipline, with sacrifice, and he had learned early that survival meant never looking back too long at what had been left behind. Meetings blurred together, territory disputes, supply routes, numbers that represented lives and futures reduced to margins and risk assessments. His voice was calm, his orders precise. No one saw cracks, no one ever did. That was his rule. The past stayed buried, because buried things could not be used against you. This was what he told himself every time the image of Valentina tried to surface uninvited. He did not speak her name, not to his men, not to himself. Names carried weight, and he refused to give her space inside his head. She had chosen distance, chosen independence, chosen to walk away from protection that was on her. He had accepted her words exactly as they were spoken. "We don't need you." Pride had wrapped around the sentence, and he had let it stand like a closed door. At night he returned to an apartment high above the city, all glass and shadows, the kind of place that looked impressive from the outside and empty. From within, the woman waiting there, Mariana, smiled, easily touched his arm, laughed at the right moments. She fit the image, calm, polished, uncomplicated. She asked nothing of him that could not be given quickly. He liked that about her. She represented a future without noise, without demands, without vulnerability. Still, when the city quieted and the lights dimmed, something restless crept in. Moments where the silence felt heavier than usual, where the control he relied on felt thinner than before. He poured another drink, stood by the window, and told himself this was nothing more than adjustment. Loss always left a temporary echo. He had seen it before in others, in men who survived worse and kept moving. What he did not know was that Valentina was not adjusting. She was preparing. What he did not see was the quiet strength it had taken to walk away, carrying more than he could imagine. What he did not question was why she had looked so certain when she spoke those words. Certainty came from knowledge, and knowledge came from truth. Adrian believed the chapter was closed. He believed the sentence meant freedom from responsibility, from obligation, from anything that could slow him down. He did not consider that the word we might have held weight beyond pride, beyond anger, beyond love. He believed power was still his greatest shield, and that nothing he did not see could ever reach him. Somewhere not far from his world, but far enough to remain unseen, Valentina worked long hours, stood on tired feet, breathed through discomfort, and kept her hands steady over her growing stomach. She spoke to no one about him, not because she feared him, but because she feared what his world could take. The decision she had made was already costing her everything, but it was one she would not undo. And as Adrian built walls higher and stronger, believing himself untouchable, the truth was already moving quietly toward him, patient, relentless, waiting for the moment his empire would bring him face to face with what he had left behind. Adrian entered the restaurant the way he entered every controlled space, with awareness, measured steps, and an expression that invited no questions. The room responded instantly. Chairs straightened, conversations softened, eyes followed him, not in admiration, but recognition this place belonged to his world even if no one said it aloud. The chandeliers glowed like restrained fire reflecting off polished surfaces and crystal glasses. The air smelled of expensive wine and discipline. This was not just a dining room, it was a front, a neutral ground where deals were whispered behind smiles, and violence never crossed the table he sat where he could see everything. Habit more than intention. Mariana spoke beside him, her voice smooth, her presence light. He nodded at the right moments, but his attention drifted, scanning faces, exits, reflections in mirrors. Then time shifted without warning, because across the room a movement caught his eye, not dramatic, not obvious, just wrong. A woman stepping between tables, carrying plates, her posture familiar, her walk slower than memory allowed, and when she turned slightly the world narrowed. His breath slowed, and his pulse struck hard against his chest. It was Valentina. There was no confusion, no possibility of mistake, even dressed in a uniform that did not belong to her, even hidden among strangers, even with her hair tied back in quiet restraint. He knew her immediately. The recognition hit like a blade pressed inward, not sharp enough to bleed, but deep enough to hurt. She moved carefully, each step deliberate, one hand steadying a tray, the other resting unconsciously near her body. And that was when he saw it, the curve that changed everything, the unmistakable truth that made his mind stall. Her stomach, rounded, heavy, impossible to ignore. The room did not change, the music did not stop, the conversations continued. But inside him something fractured. He watched as she served a table, laughed softly at something a guest said, then turned away, and in that turn he saw the fullness of her pregnancy. Undeniable, 8 months, perhaps more. The timing struck him like a cold calculation. His thoughts raced back through weeks, through memories, through the silence that followed their separation. And nothing aligned, nothing made sense. His first instinct was not anger or jealousy, it was fear, sharp and immediate, because in his world pregnancy was not just life, it was vulnerability, and vulnerability was dangerous. Mariana reached for his hand, speaking his name, asking a question. He did not hear. His gaze never left Valentina. She did not look at him, not once. It was as if she had built a wall around herself, a practiced blindness that kept her safe. And that realization unsettled him more than the pregnancy itself. She had learned to exist without seeing him, and that meant she had learned to survive beyond his shadow. A waiter passed close to her, brushing by, and Adrian felt his jaw tighten, every part of him trained to assess threats, calculated the risks. He had failed to consider when he let her walk away. He had believed distance was freedom, but now he understood distance had been exposure. The words she spoke in the office returned with new weight. We don't need you. And suddenly the sentence felt less like pride and more like preparation, as if she had already known this moment would come and had chosen to face it alone. He remained seated, forcing stillness, while everything inside him urged movement. He did not rise, did not call her name, not yet. Power taught patience, and patience kept him alive, but the seed of doubt had been planted deep. And it began to grow fast, because the question was no longer whether he belonged in her life, but whether he had ever truly understood the one she was protecting. Adrian did not move when Valentina passed his table again. The instinct to rise, to call her name, to stop the world pressed hard against his chest. But he forced it down. Control had kept him alive longer than love ever did. He watched her instead, the way her shoulders stayed squared, the way she shifted her weight carefully, the way her breath seemed measured, as if every movement was calculated to protect what she carried. And that was when the weight of it truly settled. This was not chance, this was not coincidence, this was survival in motion, and she had been doing it without him. The restaurant noise blurred into something distant, laughter, glassware, soft music. None of it reached him clearly anymore. All he could see was the subtle curve beneath her uniform and the quiet strength with which she carried it. His mind ran numbers, timelines, moments. He replayed the last weeks of their marriage, nights he stayed away, conversations. He dismissed excuses he made to himself about danger and necessity. And power, none of it fit cleanly with what stood before him. The realization crept in slowly, sharp and unforgiving, that the child could only be his, and that meant she had left already knowing and chosen silence anyway. That silence frightened him more than anger ever could. In his world, people demanded things, they took space, they made noise. Silence meant strategy, meant protection, meant a decision already finalized. He saw now what he had refused to see then. When she said, "We don't need you," she had not been rejecting him. She had been drawing a boundary between his world and the life growing inside her. and the thought struck him with an unfamiliar sense of failure, not as a husband, but as a protector. Mariana spoke again, this time louder, her voice pulling at him, asking if he was listening. He turned to her, slowly offered a nod, a practiced half-smile, words formed and left his mouth without meaning. She believed him because everyone always did, because he was convincing, because he had trained himself to appear present even when his mind was elsewhere. But his attention returned to Valentina immediately, to the way she paused near the kitchen entrance, her hand briefly pressing against her side as if steadying herself, and for the first time fear took shape, not fear of loss but fear of harm, because this place was his, and that meant enemies had passed through it, deals had been made here, men had been watched here, and she was standing in the middle of it, unguarded, unseen, unprotected. A waiter brushed past her too close, and Adrian felt something dark stir beneath his composure. He reminded himself. She had chosen this, she had said she did not need him, he had respected that decision, he had walked away. But the image before him refused to align with the version of events he had accepted, because a woman this far along, working long hours in silence, did not look like independence, she looked like determination sharpened by necessity, and the guilt came then, heavy and unavoidable, not because she struggled, but because she had never asked him to stop the struggle, and he had taken that as permission to disappear. When Valentina finally vanished through the side door, his chest tightened. He had not realized how long he had been holding his breath. The space she left behind felt larger than the room itself. And suddenly the certainty he had carried for months cracked open, revealing questions. He had never allowed himself to ask, what had she known that day in the office, what future had she already chosen, and why had she believed he would be the greatest danger to the child he never knew existed? Adrian did not follow her immediately. He stayed seated long enough for suspicion to pass, long enough for the room to return to its rhythm. Mariana spoke again, laughing at something on her phone, touching his arm. And he responded on instinct, his body present, his mind already outside, tracking exits, timing shifts, the habits of survival never turned off. When he finally rose, it was with restraint. He paid the bill, nodded once, and walked out alone into the cooler air of the street. Night had settled over the city, carrying the sound of traffic and distant voices, but behind the restaurant the alley remained narrow and quiet, a place where light thinned and truth had nowhere to hide. Valentina stood there, adjusting her coat, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, her shoulders stiffened before he spoke, as if she had sensed him without turning. When she did, her expression did not change, no shock, no fear, only a tired awareness that told him this moment had been anticipated long before it arrived. He said her name once softly, not as a command, but as a test, and the way she met his eyes confirmed everything. She was not surprised, she was prepared. "I knew you would come," she said, her voice even controlled. He searched her face for cracks, for anger, for longing, for anything familiar, but found only resolve. "You should not be here," she added, and the statement carried no plea, only boundary. He took a step closer, then stopped himself. The space between them felt deliberate, measured for safety, not distance. "I saw you inside," he said, as if the words alone might anchor the chaos in his chest. "You did not tell me." His tone was low, careful not to draw attention in his world. Volume was a weapon. She folded her arms, not defensively, but with finality. "I told you enough," she replied. His jaw tightened. "I had a right to know," he said, and the word right sounded weak even to his own ears. She laughed, then not loudly, not cruelly, just once, a short breath of disbelief. And when she spoke again, her voice cut cleaner than anger ever could. "You had rights when you were there," she said, "when I asked you to listen, when I asked you to slow down, when I asked you to see me. You chose your world over me, and I accepted that." He wanted to argue, wanted to explain danger, alliances, enemies, the constant edge he lived on, but the words refused to organize themselves, because none of them explained why she had been alone in that office, why she had walked away without demanding anything, why she now stood before him, carrying the weight of months he had never known about. "We don't need you," she said again, and this time he flinched, because now the words carried a different gravity, not rejection, but protection. He studied her face, the way her chin lifted slightly, the way her body angled, as if shielding someone unseen. That was when understanding struck, slow and heavy. The "we" was not a figure of speech, it was a declaration. His voice dropped even further. "Is it mine?" he asked, and the question hovered between them, fragile, dangerous. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked away toward the streetlights, toward the quiet stretch of road she had walked alone night after night. Then, she nodded once. "Yes," she said simply, "but do not mistake that for an invitation." The air felt thinner after that admission. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Years of command had not prepared him for this, for a truth that demanded humility rather than control. "I can protect you," he said instinctively, and she shook her head immediately. "No," she replied just as quickly, "I am protecting him." The sentence landed with finality, and he understood then what she had known from the beginning, that his power came with shadows, that his name opened doors, but also marked targets, that love in his world often ended in blood, and she had chosen certainty over hope, safety over promises, silence over spectacle. "You chose for both of us," he said, and she met his gaze without apology. "I chose for him," she corrected, and in that moment Adrian realized the most powerful decision had been made without him, and for the first time in his life the loss of control terrified him more than any enemy ever had. Adrian did not sleep that night. The city moved beneath his windows, but he remained still, seated in the dark, replaying her words, until they lost sound and became weight. The truth had not arrived like a blow, it had arrived like certainty, slow, undeniable, impossible to outrun. He had spent his life believing danger came from outside, from rivals, from betrayal, from weakness. He had never considered that the greatest risk would be something he had created and failed to protect: his mind, returned to the way she stood. In that alley, her posture firm, her voice calm, not defiant, not pleading. She had not asked him for anything, not money, not shelter, not security, because she had already decided that his world was not a gift but a threat, and that realization unsettled him more deeply than any confrontation ever had. Power had always given him answers. Tonight it gave him only questions. Before dawn, he summoned no one, made no calls, gave no orders. For the first time in years, he let the machine of his empire run without his hand guiding it. And the silence that followed felt wrong, unnatural, like standing in a room where something dangerous had been removed without warning. He poured a drink, then left it untouched, watching the liquid catch the low light as if it might speak. Instead, it reflected his face, older than he remembered, harder, less certain. He understood now that the words, "We don't need you," had never been about rejection. They had been about survival, and survival in his world had rules that did not allow innocence to remain intact. By morning, he had made a decision, not the kind that came with meetings and threats, but the kind that required restraint and patience. He did not go to her. He did not send money or guards or messages. He did not do the things that would have proven power. Instead, he watched from a distance, learned her routines, memorized the streets she walked, the hours she worked, the places she rested. He placed eyes where eyes could not be traced, and protection where protection would never reveal its source. He did not cross her boundary. But he refused to leave her exposed, because even if she believed she did not need him, he knew the world would not be so respectful. Days passed, then weeks, and the tension inside him grew, not because of waiting, but because of restraint. Every instinct he had was trained to take control, to close distance, to eliminate uncertainty. But this situation demanded the opposite, demanded stillness, demanded trust in a woman who had already proven she could survive without him. He watched her from afar, saw the fatigue she hid, the way her movements slowed, the way her hand rested more often against her body, as the weight she carried grew heavier in each time he saw it. Guilt pressed deeper, not because she struggled, but because she never once reached for him. One evening, as she left work earlier than usual, he noticed something wrong: the way she paused on the steps, the way her breath caught briefly, the way she steadied herself before continuing, in fear sharp and immediate cut through his discipline. He did not intervene, he did not approach, but he adjusted things quietly. Routes changed, cars reassigned, doors watched more closely than before, because the line between respect and negligence was thin, and he refused to cross it again. That night he finally understood the full meaning of what she had done. When she walked out of that office months earlier, she had not been leaving him. She had been stepping into a role he had failed to fill: the protector, the decision maker, the one willing to stand alone between danger and the life growing quietly inside her. And the realization humbled him in a way no loss of territory, ever could, because for the first time his power was not something to be used but something to be earned, and he did not yet know if he deserved it. Adrian learned a new kind of discipline in the days that followed, one that did not announce itself and did not demand recognition. He moved through his world with the same authority, but inside everything had shifted. Every decision now passed through a different filter, not what strengthened the syndicate, but what reduced risk to something fragile and unseen. He did not tell his men why routes were altered, why certain suppliers were quietly removed, why eyes were placed where no one would ever notice. He simply gave orders, and they obeyed, because that was how his world worked, obedience without explanation. But for the first time, his control was being used to create absence rather than presence. Danger was erased before it could form, shadows were redirected, threats dissolved without ever knowing why, and all of it revolved around a woman who refused to look back at him. He watched Valentina continue her life as if nothing had changed. She went to work, she returned home. She carried herself with a quiet determination that never softened even when her steps slowed, and the weight of her pregnancy pressed visibly against her frame. He noticed details others missed: the way she paused at corners, the way she chose well-lit streets, the way she scanned faces without appearing to. It was not fear, it was awareness, learned quickly and sharpened by necessity, and each observation cut deeper because it reminded him how much she had adapted in his absence, how strong she had become without his shadow. Then something shifted. One afternoon, a car lingered too long across the street from the restaurant. Not one of his, not one he recognized. The plates were clean, the timing wrong. His instincts flared sharp and immediate. He did not rush in, did not make a scene. Instead, he redirected traffic, closed access points, adjusted schedules. By the time the car moved on, it had never been close enough to matter, and Valentina remained unaware of how narrowly something had passed her and the child she carried that night. Adrian sat alone and realized this was what she had feared, not him, but the inevitability of attention that followed his name, and the understanding settled heavy that love in his world was never neutral, it always came with consequences. Days later, she discovered the first sign that something invisible had changed. The stairwell light in her building fixed, without a request, the security guard who suddenly appeared during her late walks. The doctor appointment moved forward with no explanation. She did not thank anyone, she did not ask questions, but her eyes narrowed slightly, and Adrian knew. She sensed him there without seeing him. The boundary she had drawn was being tested, not by intrusion, but by consistency, and that was more dangerous than force, because it invited trust, and trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to restore. He considered speaking to her again, standing before her, explaining everything: the protection, the precautions, the restraint. But every time he imagined the moment, he stopped himself. Words were easy, presence was not. He understood now that if he crossed her line, even with good intentions, he would confirm every fear she had ever had about him. So he waited, and waiting was the hardest thing he had ever done, because it meant surrendering control and allowing her to decide whether his silence was respect or abandonment. One evening she turned suddenly on the street, as if sensing eyes, and for a brief moment their gazes aligned across distance and traffic. She did not look angry, she did not look afraid, she looked tired and thoughtful, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement without permission. And in that instant, Adrian realized this was the trial not of power but of patience, not of dominance but of consistency, and that the outcome would determine not whether he could reclaim a place in her life, but whether he deserved to be allowed near the life she was protecting. The fracture came quietly, not with shouting or accusation, but with absence. Mariana noticed it first, in the way Adrian stopped reaching for his phone during dinner, in the way his attention drifted even when he sat across from her. She had always understood that his world required distant secrecy, discipline, but this was different. This was not the guarded focus of a man managing danger. This was the inward pull of someone being undone by something he could not command, and for the first time she felt herself standing beside a man whose heart was no longer accessible. She confronted him one evening when the city lights spilled through the windows, and the apartment felt too large for two people who no longer occupied the same space. Her voice was steady, controlled. She did not demand answers, she asked a single question: whether there was something he had not told her, and the pause before he responded told her everything he had not said. His silence was not defensive, it was resigned. and in that resignation she recognized the truth that she had never been part of the center of his life. She had been a safe place, a pause, a clean space between storms. Adrian did not deny it, he did not confess everything either, he simply said there was a responsibility he could not turn away from. And she understood that the responsibility had a name, even if it was never spoken. The word child did not need to be said for its presence to fill the room. She listened without interruption, watching him carefully. And in that moment she realized something painful but clear, that he was no longer choosing between two women, he was choosing between the man he had been and the man he was becoming, and she was not part of that transformation. She left without raising her voice, without anger, without asking him to follow her. The suitcase was already packed, not in secret, but in preparation. She had sensed this ending long before it arrived, and as she stood by the door she told him that she would not compete with a past that had not finished becoming the future. She wished him peace. Then she walked away, leaving behind a space that echoed with finality. The loss did not break him immediately. Instead, it stripped him of the illusion that control could preserve everything he valued. He sat alone afterward, surrounded by silence, and for the first time did not reach for power to fill it. He allowed the absence to exist because it was earned and necessary, and because somewhere across the city Valentina continued to live without asking anything from him, still choosing restraint, still refusing the safety his name could provide. What he did not know was that Valentina had noticed the shift as well, not the departure of another woman, but the change in the air around her life, the way pressure eased slightly, the way the invisible watchfulness felt less tense, less urgent. She sensed that something had been released, that a piece of his world had stepped aside, and though she did not know why, she felt the smallest easing in her chest, as if a decision she had made months ago was being honored at last. That night Adrian understood that sacrifice was not measured by what was taken from him, but by what he chose not to reclaim, and as the city moved on around him, he accepted that losing Mariana was not punishment, it was consequence, and consequence was the only language that ever taught him how to change. The call came just after midnight, and Adrian knew before he answered, because some instincts never learned patience. The voice on the other end was not panicked, but tight, controlled, the way people speak when they are holding something together with both hands. Valentina said his name once, and nothing else was needed. The city blurred as he moved, streets opening, lights changing, sound falling away, everything narrowing to one destination. He did not send an escort, did not summon men, did not secure routes. Way he once would have, he drove alone, because this was not an operation, it was a moment that could not be shared. The hospital stood bright and awake against the dark, a place where urgency erased hierarchy. He walked through doors that did not recognize him as anything other than a man moving too fast with too much focus. And for the first time in years that anonymity felt right. He found her in a room stripped of comfort machines, murmuring quietly, her face pale, her breath measured, her eyes lifting to him without surprise, as if she had known he would come, and something in his chest loosened at that silent acknowledgement. He did not speak at first. He took the chair beside her, sat close, but not too close, waiting for permission. She did not give or deny, she simply stayed. Hours stretched and folded in on themselves. Nurses came and went, instructions whispered, pain rose and fell, and through it all Adrian remained still, present, unarmed, not just in body, but in spirit. There was no commanding here, no controlling, no bending outcomes with force. There was only endurance, and the waiting stripped him down more effectively than any loss he had ever endured. Each sound, each pause, each tightening of her hand around the sheet taught him something he had never learned in his empire, that power meant nothing when life decided its own pace. At one point she looked at him fully, really looked, and he saw the question there unspoken, whether he would disappear when this became difficult, whether he would retreat into distance the way he once had. He met her gaze and stayed. And that was the answer he could give. No words would have mattered more. The room grew tense, voices sharpened, movement increased, and the weight of the moment pressed in on him, heavier than any threat he had faced outside these walls. When the final surge came and the cry broke through the air, it felt as if the world exhaled with him. Something inside him broke open, not violently, but completely. The sound was small and powerful, fragile and absolute, and when they placed the child against her chest, Adrian did not reach out immediately. He watched the way Valentina closed her eyes, the way her breath finally slowed, the way relief softened her features, and only then did she look at him and nod once. He took the child into his arms with care that bordered on reverence, every instinct recalibrating around something impossibly light, impossibly real. The weight of responsibility settled not as fear but as clarity. And in that clarity the words from months ago finally revealed themselves, not as rejection, but as instruction. We don't need you had never meant absence, it had meant transformation. It had meant leave behind the version of yourself that destroys and become the one that stays. He understood then that the night was not about arrival but permission, and that this was the only power he had ever truly been offered. The morning arrived without ceremony, pale light slipping through the hospital window. As if unsure whether it was welcome, Adrian remained seated beside the bed, his shoulders stiff from hours of stillness. The child slept in the clear cradle nearby, chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt both fragile and absolute. Valentina watched them both quietly, her body exhausted, her expression unreadable, until she finally spoke, her voice low, steady, carrying the weight of months she had carried alone. When I said we don't need you, she said, I was not trying to hurt you, I was trying to save him. The words settled between them, not sharp, not accusatory, but final. And in that moment Adrian understood the truth he had missed for so long. She had not pushed him away, she had set a condition. And he had failed it then. He had spent months learning what it required now. He nodded slowly, not in defense, not in explanation, just acknowledgement, because this was not a moment for justification, it was a moment for acceptance. He stood and moved closer to the cradle, looking down at the small face, the tiny hands, the life that had arrived without knowing fear or power or legacy. And something inside him realigned. He saw his world clearly for the first time, not as an empire to be defended, but as a danger to be managed. He realized that the most radical choice he could make was not to pull the child into his shadow, but to keep that shadow from ever touching him. I won't bring him into it, he said quietly, his voice rough with certainty. Not my name, not my wars, not my enemies. I will stand between them and him, even if it costs me everything. Valentina closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, the tension she had carried finally eased. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. She had been waiting to see if he understood, and now she knew that he did. The days that followed were not dramatic. There were no declarations, no promises spoken loudly, only actions that accumulated slowly. Adrian restructured his life with the same precision he once used to expand at roots, changed names, disappeared alliances, dissolved quietly. He did not step away from power, he reshaped it, placing distance between danger and the small apartment where the child slept. He visited without demands, without entitlement, always announced, always respectful, and each time he left something behind, not money, not protection, but consistency, and that was what began to change everything. Valentina watched him not with hope, but with attention, measuring his presence not by intensity, but by reliability, and over time, the wall she had built did not fall, but it opened a narrow gate. Months later, as the child learned to sit, then to crawl, then to reach for him with unsteady hands, Adrian felt something settle into place, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with control. Valentina stood nearby, often quiet, sometimes close, never pretending the past had not happened, but no longer living inside it. One evening, as the city dimmed, and the child slept between them, she finally spoke again. You were never useless, she said softly, you were just dangerous, and he did not argue, because for the first time he understood the difference. He had not been rejected, he had been challenged to become someone worthy of staying. And as he watched his son breathe in the quiet, he knew that nothing he had ever built mattered more than the choice he would keep making every day, to be present without possessing, to protect without controlling, and to remain even when walking away would have been easier.